This is an overview of the contamination of the Toms River and the Orongo-Duenweg mining sites by Gabrielle Saunders and Michelle Holt. So in Toms River, two of the chemicals found were trichloroethylene and nitrobenzene. There were other chemicals found, but these are the two that we focused on. And the exposure occurred when the contaminated, the groundwater became contaminated from the dumping of waste, and it eventually found its way into the drinking water and the surface water in the Toms River. Also, air contaminants could be a possibility because of while the factory was running. And then chemicals contaminated the private wells. It's unlikely that the soil was contaminated, but that's possible as well. Trichloroethylene is often exposed to people through the water supply. People accidentally drink this chemical, and then it's stored as fat in the body while it's absorbing, and then it's breathed out through and excreted through urine. Several health effects. They have damage to liver and kidney, the heart, the nervous system, the respiratory system, and the immune system. In the long term, it's carcinogenic as well. Nitrobenzene enters the body through the air, the water, and the soil. It's also been used as a food additive and to make shoe polish and acetaminophen. It can be inhaled through the air, but is mainly consumed through water. Only people near the manufacturing areas are likely to be exposed, but it's possible that it could be absorbed transdermally as well. It's toxic by methemoglobinemia and causes vertigo, headaches, nausea, and confusion, and also possibly coma and apnea. The vulnerable population is basically just children because, it was found that in the Dover Township there were 90 cases of childhood cancer seen as compared to the expected amount of 67. And then anyone who drinks the drinking water from the Toms River was at risk because of the surface water contamination, as well as people who actually worked at the manufacturing site and work on cleanup there. So again, some major health effects. It's a synthetic chemical and it's carcinogenic, and it's was ultimately found to be bad for the entire community. But again, liver damage is one of the main factors. Nitrobenzene causes cyanosis, bluish discoloration of the skin, anemia, nausea, and vomiting. And most common causes of death include industrial accident and suicide with this chemical. Trichloroethylene, so basically it threatened the health of the Toms River community because it was used at the plant, and the steel drums were dumped into the river where the trichloroethylene causes damage to immune system and inflammatory response, as well as scleroderma. In addition, the Toms River ended up being the second largest manufacturer of epoxy resin, so the workers face hazard subjection to TCE, and there was noted that kidney cancer was a factor that or a pattern that ended up as well with the workers that were exposed. So there was no perfect solution for the Toms River contamination. Before the contamination, there was only a little bit of, some tourism, some small-scale fishing. The town wasn't really on the map. And because of this, in the earlier stages of the plant's operation, the community didn't really ask any questions. The community could have probed the Ciba-Geigy Corporation more deeply when the plant started dumping immediately. But as the public became more aware, there weren't very many governmental restrictions on the Ciba-Geigy Corporation. Social paradigm shifts and environmental values take time. So basically, just the intervention didn't happen promptly enough, and the local government was negligible. Pros and cons of the company's actions. So the pros: in 2001, Ciba Chemical, the company, and Dow Chemical Company reached a settlement of $35 million with families whose children ended up with cancer, as well as Ciba Geigy brought short-term economic growth and a source of income for a lot of the residents of Toms River. The cons, though, again, there were contaminated wells and pollutants like dyes in the water supply, and this was hidden from the public. And when industrial growth peaked, the unusable byproduct and waste piled up in the manufacturing sites. And then the manufacturers began, looking for more places to dump their waste, and the Toms River ended up being one of them for them. Pros and cons of the government's actions. The pros: historically, the responsible companies like Ciba and Union Carbide ended up paying for their Superfund cleanup costs. And in 1980, there were drinking water regulations put in place by the EPA that ended up, regulating the Toms River and causing cleanup of it. And in 1995, New Jersey Department of Health investigated the childhood cancer that was caused by Toms River contamination. The cons: before the EPA, there was no federal agency that led any inquiry into Ciba Geigy Corporation. And then in 1995, the EPA had air strippers placed in their wells to ensure that all known volatiles would be removed from the drinking water, but this wasn't very effective. So the other contaminated site that we focused on was the Orongo-Duenweg mining site in Joplin, Missouri. It's a mining and smelting site that operated from the 1800s to the 1970s and had 10 million tons of surface mining wastes that contaminated the water. Two specific contaminants are lead and zinc, and cadmium was also present, so these are all heavy metals. Because the smelters operated until the 70s, there was previously fugitive dust and air emission that contaminated the air supply. Possible sources of exposure were contaminated soil, groundwater, and mine waste as well. A lot of residents used groundwater wells that had a lot of excess levels of lead and calcium, and additionally soil was contaminated in a lot of homes, like 200 homes eventually were built on soil that was contaminated with lead. Modes of entry of lead and zinc into the body include, in this case, they were ingestion through water and skin contact as well. The EPA was concerned with consumption of lead, zinc, and cadmium in the water supply and the soil. So the chemicals were consumed in the drinking water, and they can be ingested if food was grown in the soil or if the soil particles were consumed. The skin that entered contact with the soil could also result in chemical entrance into the body. Again, the vulnerable population in this case is actually children again. That's because, well, first of all, there were 6 nearby daycare sites with soil contamination, and the Missouri Department of Health found that 14% of children under 7 had excess blood lead levels higher than the standard amount. And then when the soil is contaminated, children who play in the yard are at high risk for exposure because children exhibit hand-to-mouth behavior. So they eat the soil and then they play in the soil. And there are no real safe levels of lead in children, and even really low amounts have been known to cause damage. And then the other problem is that lead exposure is typically without symptoms, and symptoms that do appear are nonspecific. Lead is pretty damaging because it's a neurotoxin, and children have neurological systems that are still developing, and they have smaller bodies overall, which means they're sensitive at lower levels of lead. 2 main health effects of zinc. So the body is 3 to 4% zinc, so it needs a good balance of zinc in it. It needs some zinc, but harmful amounts excess harmful amounts can cause metal fume fever, and side effects like nausea and vomiting. Metal fume fever is a short-term illness related to, just exposure to zinc, dust, or fumes. And it's been associated with people who are metal workers, so people who worked at the mine were susceptible to this disease. The onset of the disease happens within a couple days of exposure, and symptoms are fever and chills. Another side effect of zinc poisoning is nausea and vomiting. So many members of the community in the Oronogo-Duenweg mining site actually exhibited these symptoms. Lead, again, it's a neurotoxin for children. So children have a risk of developing neurodegenerative diseases and have lower cognitive function. It can also cause miscarriage in women and spontaneous abortions. To prevent Orongo-Duenweg, the community would have needed to shift the environmental mores of their era and discourage the romanticism that was associated with mining. And hundreds of mining companies operating in the area were operating in the area. So, this was just one of the many that was, shown to be bad for the environment. But it wasn't possible to shut down all of these businesses, so it was kind of hard to just pick and choose. Pros and cons of the company's actions were that it did give good economic growth as a pro, but the cons, again, are that it contaminated hundreds of drinking water wells, and the study, again, that I cited before showed that the children had excess blood lead levels. The government, so in 2003, there was a 78% reduction in the number of children with elevated blood lead levels. So again, the government did take action, and that is a pro. And between 1995 and 2003, the EPA cleaned up and removed contamination and smelter waste from 2,495 people's yards, which is a really big amount when you think about it. And the EPA's cleanup work at operable units 2 and 3, where residential properties and operable unit 4, the drinking water supply, are finally complete. But the cons are, as of 1995, the cost of Superfund sites has shifted to taxpayers and congressional funding, which ultimately leaves and left the cleanup of the sites like this mining site with delays because they don't have the funding for it anymore. And then bureaucratic processes on the mining site moved slowly. The site wasn't identified until 1986 by the EPA, and the actual cleanup didn't start until nearly a decade later. So this is a really slow process in cleanup because all the hoops have to be jumped through. And in the meantime, people were living on contaminated soil. So as you can see, overall, there were actually a lot of similarities between the Toms River and the Orongo-Duenweg mining site in terms of showing children as a vulnerable population and having a really slow cleanup process, and as well as just kind of, turning a blind eye while the contamination did happen. So I think environmental lessons to be learned from this are just that speak up when you see something and to take action in the appropriate channels through government action to create changes to better the population, the health of the population. And these are just the references that we included.